Well, welcome back to the Built Different podcast, fellas. Back in black today. Did we all coordinate? I feel like this is the second time that we've done this, where we're all rocking the black outfits.
It just looks so good. Drone to Play has such great swag that we all rock the black. It's great.
I feel like it's the classic color, though, Brian. I mean, looks good on anyone. The classic polo you got going there today looks good.
It's definitely easier to justify than the blurple sometimes.
Ooh.
It doesn't really go with most of my wardrobe, but
Marketing team trigger.
I think we coined that phrase, blurple. I would say it sounds as bad as it is to say, so let's just leave it at that. But you look good, fellas. Great to be back. Another great week. I'm not freezing out in the shed. The cold weather has turned here in the south, and it's good to have you back. All right, let's run into it. Let's get into what the rundown is today. I'm excited. One, I think we all picked our own kind of segments and topics today, so this is going to be pretty interesting. We're right turn, left turn, and straight ahead. All pretty different. I wouldn't say that they may be related to each other, but yeah, we're going to talk about some robotics stuff. Just a lot going on, I feel like, in the news and some stuff that's coming out this week. And then Brian, I know this one's going to be pretty near and dear to your heart. I need like this like voice button or this audio button that's like in the contract. I feel like always something said on a job site of just, oh yeah, go check out the contract. It's always in there.
Or an RTF or an RTFC button. One of
RTFC button. We'll tease that one at the end here of what that actually means. And then Adam, I know you're sore from this weekend. A fun competition there. Looking all buff, maybe that's why you're rocking the 2 sizes too small shirt today, but hey, that's all right.
Man, this is the schmedium, dude. Come on.
It looks very schmedium. That's why I'm rocking my sweatshirt here. No buff zone. Yeah, no buff zone. But fellas, let's jump into the first one here. Let's get into robotics. Personally, this is my segment, so I'm pretty excited to talk about it. And that is just all things that are going on in the world of robotics. I feel like we mentioned this in a couple episodes back of just what's like robotics that come out for like a personal life, how that bleeds over into your kind of work life. Honestly, why I wanted to talk about this, let's see if I can pull up my screen here. I came across a couple of these videos, and one, I just thought it was interesting. It kind of made me think of like, should I not trust robotics as much as I do in this world? And let's see if I can get this video to play here and pop up into my screen. This is, for those that are listening, you got to watch too, because sometimes we pull up some pretty awesome clips here, and I just think these are pretty worthy to be shown here. But let's see if I can get this to pop up here. Let me see if I can get my audio working. This is a police driver that pulled over a Waymo.
St. Paul, and there's no driver. Hi!
Connected to driver support. This call may be recorded for quality assurance.
Yeah, this is Officer Hines, Phoenix PD. So, your car here drove into oncoming lanes of traffic.
Okay, I will go ahead and take a look at that right now.
Yeah, there's like a little bit of a construction area, and it went into opposing lanes of traffic, which is real bad.
So far?
Yeah.
I couldn't help but come over just out of morbid curiosity.
Yeah.
I thought maybe there's a passenger or something.
No, like, the construction here?
Yeah.
It was,
All right, I'll leave it at that, one, because it's just phenomenal. If you haven't drove a Waymo, well, maybe this isn't the best advertising for them, but this was just hilarious. So Brian, Adam, myself, we all got to experience Waymo firsthand back in October last year. We had our conference out in Phoenix, and fellas, I was going to get this video pulled up of my first experience. I actually filmed it for my wife because she didn't believe me that I was riding in an autonomous car, but it really made me think. I was like, this is amazing. If I could pull up that video, you guys would all laugh at me, probably as bad as Ted Lasso, but it was phenomenal. I was like, this
video and sent it to my family too when we were down there.
Oh, well, that's kind. Yeah, it was crazy, right? And then I saw this and I was scrolling past it. So for those that weren't watching, it was a body cam footage from a police officer, and obviously you heard the audio. It was like, all right, well, this is how this is going down, and But yeah, I found it fascinating just looking at these things. I was like, man, I can personalize being in this vehicle. And it's really cool because it shows you a little display down at the bottom in between the seats. You know where you're going. But can you guys imagine if this thing just takes down into a construction area wrong way and you get pulled over, by the way? Like, let's just like put ourselves back. I don't know. It was fascinating to me. I loved Waymo. I feel kind of giving them a disservice here of showing some bad parts about it, but it was phenomenal. And now I'm kind of sitting here and not that this like totally changed my experience of them as a company, or it just made me think of, wait a second, hey, robotics are always going to have some sort of flavor of adoption and change and improvement over time. But yeah, I just wanted to kind of open up this topic of like what has been kind of your guys' personal experience into whether like it's like robotics in your personal life and or like what it's looked like bringing into your work life. Because I feel like if the last couple of years all been AI, right? AI everything, chatbots this, like robotics aren't too far behind. And I think what's pretty interesting about it is at least people are talking about it. Like it's becoming more and more mainstream, especially as I think robotics gets into like this humanoid concept. Adam, what's that movie from, gosh, way back in the day, iRobot. You guys ever watch iRobot? I mean, that I feel like was the movie that put robotics on the like, I mean, it was probably 20 years ago. Connor's got to fact check me here, but I mean, that was like this humanoid robot coming into play of like, oh yeah, like this is going to be the future. And now here we are, Tesla's coming out with their, humanoid robot of putting, Tesla cars. Anyway, I'm just curious to hear your guys' backstory with robotics, personal life, work life, doesn't matter. I just think this is fascinating. I have another video I'm going to show of a humanoid here in a second, but yeah, who wants to take it, fellas? Because I mean, I'm rocking over here a Roomba, thinking I'm like living in the 21st century, cleaning up our house, and I don't know. I just think they're awesome. But yet, and I see videos like this, I'm like, yeah, maybe I should pump the brakes a little bit. Would I put my family in one of these things and go down a construction zone? Maybe not.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the personal life, you called it Roomba was the first thing that came to mind, right? We have this, silly little circle that goes around, cleans up all the dog hair and cleans up all the mess we make. And, that Alexa is another one. I don't know necessarily if that fits in the robotics category as much as like the, just the AI piece. I have personal experience with Spot through construction site and drone deploy and just playing around with that. The thing that maybe my take on it is like, having now hands-on experience with Spot, obviously the reality capture robotics world, like all the stuff that we've been looking at from the tech side of things, there's an interesting line between robotics and automation. And I think that we recently held an event for a bunch of superintendents on a number of different robotic solutions for construction. And what's interesting is how much human intervention still has to go into these things. So your Waymo example, it's a car, it's automated, but I mean, there's still, I think, a lot of human behind that. In that instance, obviously the humans weren't watching and the car kind of did its own thing. My personal experience with the ones in Scottsdale when we were down there was taking it back from one hotel to the other, later at night, not a lot of cars on the road, come up to a 4-way stoplight to make a right turn. And all of a sudden, Waymo hits the brakes. And what's cool is on the screen, if you remember, Grant, you can see kind of the LiDAR readings about what it's seeing around it. And there was like a plastic, like a grocery bag, piece of trash in the gutter that it saw as like an obstacle and just hit the brakes real hard. Kind of scared me, because another thing that you didn't mention was how quickly our brains, I mean, my brain, your brain, probably within a minute and a half of being in that car the first time, I went back to my normal Uber experience of texting, scrolling through Instagram, whatever. I was no longer caring that no one was actually driving this vehicle. And so that slamming on the brakes really caught my attention and caught me off guard. So, a number of ways to go with that, but there's still a lot of humans behind all this automation or behind all this robotics too.
Brian, do you feel like the stories, like almost these videos or the mishaps almost draw more attention to robotics these days more than the like, because what we didn't talk about is the track record Waymo has. It's like crazy. If you look at some of the statistics they have is like how many miles and how many hours of safe driving compared to like an average per, like, I think there's 3 cities. It's Austin, San Francisco, and San Fran and Scottsdale, that like, it's crazy to compare, obviously the the human driver to their statistics of what they're pulling on there. But like, yeah, do you feel like these stories almost elevate more people talking about them, like the mishaps?
I mean, like here's the reality of the scenario. I've been in plenty of Ubers that had humans driving it, where I've been more terrified in my life than in any other Waymo that I've experienced, right? And I think there is something to be said, right? So for anyone who's driven a motorcycle or has a motorcycle, most of the time it's like, great, yeah, motorcycles are dangerous, but like let's dive deeper into that. It's usually caused by other people in the cars that are driving off, pushing the bikes off roads or having accidents because they're not checking blind spots. I think the scenario is, until every car on the road essentially is an automated car and they could communicate in some sort of way, you're always going to have some sort of external factor like that. But also to be said there, you also just have the ability to correct something for the majority of all Waymo cars, right? So say they didn't have the ability to pick up construction cones. Great, that's an update that gets pushed across their entire fleet. It's not just one person's scenario of like, oh, I've never been on the street before, I don't know how to use a roundabout, which was every Uber driver in Miami. I'm sorry, I don't know what's going on down there, but they just did not know how to use roundabouts, and people would like stop in the middle of it. It's like, great, but you would almost go through that same process with every specific individual. But if that was one Waymo update, that's every single car I'm going to be in from now on.
Here's an interesting question, Adam. You said this a little bit ago. It's kind of made me think. Do you feel like robotics and automation are synonymous? Like, are they almost the same term to you guys, or are they different? Where are they different? How are they different? Because I think even hearing you say that, Adam, I'm like, yeah, they to me are synonymous. Like I think of them almost as the same term, but yet obviously they have different, applications and things like that too. But yeah, are they the same thing to you? Because eventually I want to transition this over into either the construction world or the built environment, all these different, robotics that are coming out or automation in that way. But are those terms the same to you all?
They're different to me, actually, and it's only because I think that your like the natural inclination for the common person is to hear robotics and automation and think, or it's one before the other. I think the word robotics gets thrown around a lot more as kind of a household term, and I think with that the natural inclination is to think automation and no human involvement. Right? There's a bunch of software controlling these robots, or even worse than that, the robots are controlling themselves, quote unquote. Right? They're sentient. But having now been in the tech space long enough and in the position that we're in, I've gotten to see behind, the curtain a bit. And again, having personal experience with Spot, being the Spot handler for some reason for construction site back in the day, there's a lot of human interaction or intervention that happens to get a robot to go from point A to point B, right? Over time, those things become more seamless. We build in automation. But yeah, I think the general public thinks robots and taken over. But I personally, at this point, my definition is robotics is the hardware, automation is the brains and the software behind it.
Yeah. Yeah, good point. Brian, any thoughts to that? Or I have something I could pull up here too.
I think about a lot of people look at robotics and they think PhD student, like, graduate is just going to have free thinking and they're going to just do and know that they're supposed to be doing. But I still see them as summer intern, give them a repetitive task and let them do that same thing again and again and again, and either get good at it or graduate out of it into another type of task, right? But yeah, specifically in those scenarios, I think Waymo is probably the furthest of free will than we've probably seen with robotics in public, all the way down to, let's say the Dusty Robotics printing dog, right? That scenario is you feed it, an input. It has to be within its parameters, great, and then it just go and does that job on every single level going forward, right? It has a very defined task of what it's going to be used for, when it's going to be used for, and it's going to be done again and again. So I think we still have a long ways to go from, the Waymos being on the job site. I believe that people just assume, you're going to have it going around and just understanding quality control checks and things like that. But I mean, I hope I'm proven wrong.
I don't know. I've heard some pretty ambitious marketing material out there, Brian, that's happening today. Maybe that is, or maybe that isn't the case. But
what I will say is sometimes, and to play the devil's advocate against myself on that one, is the amount of time people don't realize it takes to actually get a message out there. Like the messaging of robotics to start now, and it could take a year and a half before it actually catches up, and the tech's probably going to fall right in line, right?
Yeah.
Something like
I think what's interesting too, similar to I think what we're all kind of maybe experiencing with AI, is just this kind of burden of, and burden's not the right word, but just this responsibility of education. Like, how do you educate people around what is possible, what it can do, what it's, we've talked about here on this show, like what its limitations are, and when you should maybe probably not upload certain documents into ChatGPT or other AI tools. But I think just the education piece is really fascinating. I want to pull up this image here that talks about just like levels of autonomy. And I feel like this is a little bit of synonymous into robotics as well, because anytime that you're trying to describe or educate someone, I've found myself going back to this kind of image or description, which just breaks down level 0 to level 5 of automation. And in this case, it obviously talks about cars. Adam, I think you've seen this one before, which is just like no automation level 0 to level 5, which is like full automation. The vehicle will be fully autonomous under all conditions, no human input. That's essentially Waymo, right? That you get in and there's no human inputs other than overriding it, in the term of this police officer pulling the car over. But I think this is really fascinating because anytime that you're diving into a technology, again, you feel that opportunity to help educate folks, but you kind of have to say, where are we now? Because if that's going to be what it is that you're trying to strive towards, right? Like automation on a job site really is, and I would kind of call it level 0 or level 1, which is, no automation, or, in this case, driver assistance is the term for, level 1. But yeah, I mean, there is autonomous tools that are happening out on job sites today. Adam, you mentioned your Super Summit last week of just different tools that do require human input, but are automating or augmenting, maybe in this way, an ability to do a task repetitively and obviously safer and things like that too. So I don't know. I just found this as an interesting, tool and I literally just Googled it here, levels of autonomy. So if you haven't seen that, I would just encourage you, because I think all three of us have been in positions where we're trying to answer questions of either folks that are incredibly excited about this being brought into our industry, and then are very skeptical about it being brought into our industry. And I think what has helped, and Brian, I'm chuckling at the story you probably remember of when we brought this up of, hey, what is full level of another idea? I think levels are a helpful way to kind of break some things down to help explain things to folks. But yeah, it just is interesting that this kind of cuts through that of, okay, let's define what it is and how do you define it? Because here's where essentially we see our industry at. So yeah, and maybe just to transition us into the like work side of it. I mean, Adam, you've mentioned kind of your background with working with robotics and autonomy, but Brian, yeah, what's been your experience, and like what have you kind of seen as you've been in your career and seen it, whether out on a job site or on this side of the fence on the tech side?
I think history is always bound to repeat itself, right? So if you want to look at robotics today, look at other tech that has come and gone way too early than it was ready for the field. Let's talk about augmented reality. The Microsoft HoloLens was something that promised the world. The Magic Leap marketing videos of a whale jumping through the air in an auditorium in front of hundreds of students ended up being a completely false video. At the time, no way that existed, right? You did not see that?
No. You're saying some whale jumped like through, like
yeah,
have a HoloLens on?
No. It was presented as if it was like a project. Yeah, Google it up in the background.
Oh my gosh.
It was like the first video that made the biggest splash, no pun intended, on augmented reality and projection AR, and why Magic Leap probably got so much funding before it even had a product that really worked.
Double win if you can name the year. I did find it here. Let's see if I can pull it up.
2016.
Wow, Brian, you are incredible.
2016.
I'm on the ad play here. Let's see if I can bring it over. Man, I hate that for the people that are just listening to us. Let's see if I can pull this up here. Am I even showing the right one?
Yep. Yeah.
Here, let me go to the best part of the video here.
Yeah, there.
Whoa! So everyone has a HoloLens on? Is that the idea?
No. this video was shown as if it was like some projection augmented reality, like they had some
Interesting.
hologram live in person.
I should probably watch this. Oh, here you go. Magic Leap. There you go. Brian, you actually do know what you're talking about. Look at your fact checking here.
And the Tupac hologram was not too close around this time also. So I think the hype, it was kind of a mixture of things.
Dude, I got hologrammed in real life. Sorry, jumping in real quick. I went to a country concert way back in college, and I forget who it was, like Jason Aldean or Luke Bryan or one of them. And out of like the last song, dude, Carrie Underwood walks out on the stage and they do a full duet.
Yeah.
And we're like, what?
Adam, this is Brian's time to shine. I'm gonna go back.
Sorry. Well, my point is, I got hologrammed in real life, and we had to Google it afterwards, and we looked up her tour dates. She was actually in like Texas or something, but they hologrammed us on the stage. It was wild.
Yeah, you also have 100, actually like $1 million production team. It's contained in a room. But the reality of the scenario is when you bring things in the field is
that sounds ripe for a construction site. $100 million
lighting,
contained space.
Literally, like the lighting on a job site is never really consistent, which affects the slam tracking of whatever you're trying to anchor. The texture of the ground being like a complete finished concrete, right? Like not having much to grab on. There were so many issues, and then let's just talk about Wi-Fi on a site, right? Like unless you can completely preload something. What I thought was always funny is, and I'll tell you a quick little story is when I first joined the company I was working for, I was brought on as an innovation manager, and the hype around virtual reality happened because one or two owners I think asked about, hey, are you guys doing virtual reality? Without the question of what are you using it for? How can we use it, right? Like architectural visualization, great, coordination, great. But it was almost like, hey, we need a VR headset on every single project, which also at the time required, I think this was like the HTC Vive days, which required a computer system, a whole trailer setup, etc. And most of them ended up sitting there just kind of hanging out because there was no clear definition of how we were going to use this, when we were going to use it, how we were going to recover cost. And
is that what you're kind of like equating robotics to, though? Like just kind of the space of VR or just augmented reality, virtual reality? Like,
I think we're more dead set on the solution, like robotics, augmented reality. It's just a word that's getting thrown around where I'm hearing less and less, except for like, the layout robots, right? I love those because it's a very clear defined problem or something that they're going after. If it is a problem for some companies or not, that's a whole nother discussion. But I would say when we're talking about robotics in general, I would just like to hear more about what problem specifically are we looking to focus on?
Well, that's a great segue, Ryan. I think we should probably, we've teased it a minute about like the Super Summit last week and the robotics being kind of the title topic. Maybe just for some context, and maybe we can even link the recording to that webinar in the comments here, Grant, for people to watch later. But Brian, I had Dusty, I had Hilti. We featured Drone Deploy's robotic solution as well as Canvas. I don't know if you're familiar with all of those. Obviously, you've called out Dusty a couple times for the people watching. Automated floor layout for framing, MEPs, the various different in-wall systems. Hilti, the specific problem they are solving with the JBot, JAIBOT, is overhead drilling for post-installed anchors. Drone Deploy, obviously, we have a robotic solution that will sit on top of a number of different platforms for reality capture, laser scanning, photos, all those different things, automating that task. And then Canvas is drywall finishing. So to your point, Brian, every single one of these solutions is automating a task, where I think the household sort of interpretation, to your point earlier, Grant, about robotics being sort of this vision of the future where you see these videos of Atlas and the various humanoid robots, and your brain immediately goes to iRobot, right? You called it out earlier, where we just tell the robot, hey, go frame that wall up. And it just goes out there, pulls the tape, starts screwing studs together. And, we think that that's what's coming. Maybe down the road, sure, one day, but we're a ways away from that. So I think to your point, Brian, we're seeing a lot of efficiencies and a lot of tasks individualized that are being augmented and made better through the use of robotics. But in two of those cases, the companies that I called out, 2 of them are completely human operated. So the task is being done by a robotic solution that is human operated on some joysticks, whereas the other 2 have much more automation, where you preload in, your layout file, you preload in an area that you want to be captured, right? So there's definitely a distinction between robotic automation.
Keyword there, preload in, right? How many times have we heard about someone saying, yeah, we started this job with half done drawings, as well as we'll go figure it out in the field, right? That thing is going to print exactly what you give it. If you don't have like the system, the timing set down, you may not even people start mobilizing right on that slab the second it's cured. Like, great. It wasn't communicated to the team that this needed to be left untouched, right? You can't just start moving your gang boxes on it right away. That's all part of the things that don't really get talked about.
Yeah, I think what's fascinating,
you got to have a good schedule, a good superintendent managing the field, and yeah, if the floor's got stuff on it already, and you try and release the layout Roomba, you're going to have some issues, right? So
I have had that happen at home though. But now they have one that like has a claw on it that can like move all my kids' toys out of the way. And
have you seen the octopus tentacle on the end of the one that I've seen in the recent videos?
But that's what I'm saying. Maybe Dusty or the site print, maybe they just need an arm on it to just like move and shove things out of the way on a job site.
Yeah, but look, I actually ran into an issue with this with Rugged Robotics on one of my sites when they were first testing years ago. And, then you had the labor steward come up and say, hey, why is the robotics guy pushing a broom around my site? This is a union job. You can't just touch it.
That was a really good question that came up on the Super Summit from one of the superintendents that was on the call. And in the chat, he threw in there when we were looking at the J-Bot, I think the Hilti machine. And he's like, hey, have you guys had any issues with operators claiming that piece of equipment? Because there was a human who the company that was talking was implying that it was part of the mechanical team. And it's like, well, the operators might claim actually the joysticks on that. And I had a personal experience back in my day where I had the operators claiming the operation of a spider crane that the curtain wall contractor was operating. And it was like, I had to go get an operator to come out to run this crane that they had never touched, that the Glazers were completely familiar with, had used it on every other job. And so the conversation around, well, okay, which union's going to claim this operation of this robot? That was a whole nother real topic that I didn't even think about before this.
Yeah, it's not a big deal when there's plenty of work, but when work gets tight, that's what your steward's there for, to defend your trade, like, right? And does that person know to use green sweep? Like, these are all conversations that need to be happened before you realize what you're going to preload into it.
Would you guys say that the printing, the layout printing applications, because there's probably 3 of them, right? You said Rugged Robotics, Site Print, Dusty Robotic. Like, I think, because where I'm going with this is like, how is maturity defined? Like, how is like the scope of that work or the maturity of that platform? Like, to me, it's when multiple people come into the space, right? Like when 2 or 3 big names, HP, big name, Dusty and Rugged, both kind of startup applications that were really there first. But I think that definitely shows a sign of like, hey, maybe this is something to like catch on to. That obviously, I think you're right, Brian. Like, you got to think about all the other factors that come into it. But I would argue like that's what makes a better job, right? When you're thinking about all those things to eventually give it the floor, give it the space, give it the cleanliness it needs to go and come back and have all of those things done. Oh, by the way, now you can put, door names down and instructions on the slab for different, like, so it's just, to me, it's just a fascinating discussion of like, are these helping? Are they hurting? Is it net positive? I don't think it's definitely not net negative, but is the pace in which, we all want it to progress faster than it should be? And I think, again, you look back to your personal life, it's like, is that happening at your home front? Like we went from a Roomba to now a lawn care robot that can do the same thing. So I don't know. It's just interesting.
I think it brings up good conversations that challenge, is our current process the best process right now, right? For example, I'm less worried about the technology doing what the technology says it can do within certain limits. It's more about, for example, concrete AI, right? We were having drones fly concrete decks before they were poured. And the question we got, well, hey, we're still banging in sleeves the morning of the pour. That's not going to detect it. Yeah. of course, it's going to detect what's there, but why are we banging in sleeves the morning of the pour? It's like, great, because things get changed, things get moved around. And I think that's also like, okay, great. It's going to detect what has already been installed, whether that's out of tolerance or what isn't there. And if you know what's not there, but you already have a plan to go put it in, or the map flew it 2 hours before they got put in, great. I think you just have to take it at face value of how we use this document, not as this document is the all-in-one solution to all of our problems.
Here's maybe totally. Here's maybe a final question, and we'll put a bow on this one. Is what tasks or what parts of your operation are you willing to change to make robotics work? Because I think at the end of the day, there are things that you need to adjust. You can't just drop this thing in and make it work and expect to have outcomes that are just, substantial. So Brian, in your case, it's like, hey, are you willing to say, hey, hands off deck 6 hours before the pour? That sounds crazy to, I think, Adam, I saw your look there, like a lot of superintendents in the field that are like, no, I'm using every hour of every minute or every minute of every hour to get all these things in. And hey, by the way, if you want me to be off 6 hours beforehand, that's 6 hours that I could be pouring concrete. So it's just interesting. That's the way I look at it. I mean, because I remember the first time my wife told me, she's like, I got to clean up before my robot or my Roomba goes out. I'm like, no, that's what that thing is for. Like, I'm going to let that thing go and do its thing. It's like, well, no, you got to get stuff out of the way and you got to get the floor clean. It's like, wait a second, hold on here. If I'm doing that, I might as well just vacuum the floor too. But I think what's interesting about it is when you play it over into our professional world, it's like, hey, you got to think at least about that stuff too, to say, hey, is it going to work? Obviously the Dusty, Rugged, and HP world, it's like, you can't print on a floor that's dirty. You might as well, put some thought and attention into what that workflow looks like before you go out there. So that to me,
my take here, Grant, is your original question was, what are we going to change to make the robotics work? I think is honestly, no offense, I think that's the flawed question about this whole thing. It's what your actual personal sentiment about the Roomba when your wife sent it out there is what I think actually matters. And you apply that mentality of, no, I'm not picking it up. That's why I got the damn robot. Like, that's the mentality that the field has right now, where the reason that Dusty and HP and like the site print robots are finding success and they're finding, implementation is because some companies, and in fact, one of my job sites in the beginning was one of them. Some companies have said, hey, that's an interesting solution. Let's go purposefully clear a floor. Let's coordinate with the field. Let's go trial this so that we can prove out the value of its actual application. And in doing so, we realized, interesting, we can spend, a few upfront hours with our labor force, making sure the floor is clean, making sure gang boxes are out of the way from this grid line to this grid line, so we can set that little thing loose. And what we get is a much more efficient and accurate end product that the framers love, the MEP guys love, the super on the job got to take 2 days off the schedule for. Like, it net positive increased it. But the only way to do that is by winning the approval of the field. None of these things are going to be, hey, let's do robotics for the sake of doing robotics, with the original question there. I think like everything else, or like a lot of other things, and this is my normal tune that I sing, if you can get a field for person, superintendent, foreman, framing crew, general contractor, whoever, if you can get those guys and gals to say that was valuable, the extra little work that we had to do up front for that output is tenfold, 10x, like, this is great. That's when companies start actually adopting this and you see these things getting implemented.
I'm going to add something there too. Sorry. Yeah, no, Grant, go ahead.
No, I mean, man, I love Spicy Hour with Adam. It's been a pretty fun-filled week already. I think what's interesting about that, though, is like, you have to go into it with this mindset of like, it can't just be a one-to-one value of like, oh, if I change my workflow, then I get only one piece of outcome improved.
10x, I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. It's got to be more valuable than what we had to put into it.
Yeah. Brian, go for it.
And I think just to double down on what Adam's saying, it's you have to market it or let people know that this is in a testing phase where this works in a perfect scenario. And we're trying to adjust it for the reality of what the field is. I think the technology companies kind of start adjusting more. I'm going to talk about modeling software, right? You laser scan a building, you bring it into Revit, and you get it drawn over. Great. Things aren't perfect. they're sloped. The reality of the slab is actually, there's like low depression spots, there's high spots, etc. Right? Like, why isn't that reflected in the modeling software?
Just
People
split
are
the
going to
difference.
take yeah, right? Like, they take you laser scan to get this, like, the most realistic representation of reality, right? That's as good as you could probably get it. Then you bring it into a software, you draw all straight lines, and then you take only the model. Like, what is going on here? And I think that's the kind of conversations we need to have is, we're laser scanning, but are we getting 100% of the scan, or are we coordinating with the scan and the model at the same time with the multiple layers?
Yeah, I think maybe this truly is the bow on this one. It's like robotics and automation have to tackle more than a one-to-one task operation. Like SitePrint, obviously they're doing multiple trades, right? When you think about robotics walking or moving around a job site, they're doing multiple tasks, right? So it's just interesting because I think that maybe that's the thing that eventually gets folks over the hump. And I don't know, on a personal life, it's like, yes, the Roomba at home is just vacuuming, and I'm okay with that. Like, I'm not spending my time vacuuming. It's doing it while I'm out of the house. But yeah, on the work sense,
point, I've given the feedback internally, about our robotic solution for, the task of reality capture. Right now, it's typically an intern out in the field, but guess what? That intern can also make coffee, right? Spot doesn't have that capability just yet. So can we justify sending Spot out when in reality I have a, $25 an hour intern? Great, let's do that.
And if that budget's coming from the same place, that intern eventually becomes, your future head superintendent or project manager.
It's actually a very interesting segue. Wasn't planning on this, but we're definitely going to roll with it here. Of talking about tech and tools in the contract, because Brian, I think there are some owners, some customers, some clients out there that put this stuff in the contract, not maybe knowing why, or maybe having a root reason of its goal or outcome and putting that in. So I don't know if this is where you wanted to dive into that topic around kind of what's put in the contract from a tools or tech perspective, but I do find it interesting. Robotics, maybe not the tallest or most prevalent one today, but I do find it interesting. I have seen some contracts that are like, no, we are going to use this tool, and maybe they don't know why, and maybe they've been sold something that isn't quite the outcome that can be. So I'm going to launch this one to you and kick us off. What are we going to talk about here in the contract?
Yeah, so I want to focus more on photo documentation because that's more of my area of expertise of actually getting it into some sort of contract language within a company, right? So there's a quote. Have either of you read the book Atomic Habits by James Clear? Yeah, great. It's a super viral book in the last couple of years. And I figured, okay, great. Like, maybe there's something to get out of that book. And I remember hearing this quote. It was, "You do not rise to the level of your goals. You fall to the level of your systems," right? It's very easy. Yeah, it's very easy to get everybody's buy-in at the beginning of the job when everyone's all happy, happy on the same page, doing great. But, when you're pushing someone on a schedule and you said, "Hey, I thought you were going to be taking, these 360 photos every week." Well, it's like, well, are you paying for that? Like, is that owned already? Or is that something we're just been doing, but we now need that same manpower time to be deployed on quality control issues, right? And without having like budgeted times or even people's job descriptions to account for what they are doing, I think that is such a big conversation to have. But if you look at existing contract language right now, let's just talk about Division 1 specification, right? It's very generic kind of contract language of, we want periodic photos, we want them cataloged by date, right? But like, what does that really look like?
Glossy 8.5 by 11s in 3-ring binders. Come on, man. Everybody's still, most companies, most jobs are still on the 1970s Div 1 photographic documentation spec.
Yeah. And like, is it time that we put something out there for people at this point? Like, what is it going to take for people to really, I don't know. I think my favorite quote is probably, "What gets measured gets done." And unless you have a good benchmark of what the team has signed up for, you can't really hold them accountable to not doing the thing that you agreed upon in your own head, but you're not the one having to do it.
How many owners, Brian, do you think know what is actually in the Division 1 spec? What percentage?
I mean, Oh, I mean, I would say like it's up to the design team really to make sure that
Is
they
your
are.
question specifically the photographic documentation, or are you saying the
No,
overall
I'm
division?
just saying so Division 1 spec, right? It's the most probably broad and general. Like, I mean, obviously it's called that for the general requirements, but like, I don't know, it just almost feels like a junk drawer of all the things on the job that don't fall into these like CSI master format, specific scope of work. And so I don't know. I just find it interesting that it one, it's the first one, and yet it's probably the least understood and or up to date and or collaborated on and or expected what should happen within the project. And I don't know. I just find it interesting how that could be. I'm like, wait a second. Like, if this is what's going to start the book, usually you don't just skip the first chapter of a book and then hop into everything. Obviously, you're working on scopes of work, but I don't know. I find that interesting. Of just like, how can that be that we don't really even know what's in it? And I think I have opinions, but I'll leave those to the discussion as we continue.
I think, I mean, from my perspective, and again, Brian, I don't know what direction you want to go with this, but to your point, Grant, like I think Division 1 and what's written in there is sort of like the tale as old as time of the original construction stuff, right? It's like it's really just how to operate from an owner's perspective with some basic guardrails, and it's a section that is ripe for some innovation, right? I think, and obviously in our business we focus on the photographic, documentation side of things, which is just one portion of it. I think that to your point, a lot of companies, owners specifically, and GCs, they read it. It usually says the same thing each time, so we kind of cliff notes it and we just move on, right? Everybody knows, yeah, it's there. But until you start to have a technology or something that hits specifically to one of those things, one of those requirements in there, you don't really look at it as like, hey, let's innovate on that spec section. And that, I think, is where you're going with it, Brian, is on that documentation piece, the photo stuff.
I'm just going to say, as a technology manager, it is your responsibility to talk within your organization to figure out what is the most enforceable contract document that you are going to be held to as a standard by that ownership when the project is done. The worst thing you can do is tell an owner you're going to do a thing, get to the end of the project, them expecting something different, and then having this huge thing blow up and potentially lose repeat work.
I mean, yeah, I mean, definitely agree. No one wants to. I mean, we've talked about this on the show too. Like, the last impression is often more impactful than the first impression. But I think what's interesting though is, and could be different. Maybe it is different. But is it usually the owner that creates it, or is it usually the design team that's creating it? Because I feel like that oftentimes plays into what's in it. And obviously, everyone reviews it before you sign the contract, right? Like, you shouldn't be surprised by what's in any of the contract documents. But I think that is also interesting too, of who authors it, or who's the copy paste document coming from, because that is important to the overall contents of what's in it. And oftentimes I think it is just like, oh, yep, okay, cool, moving on. Like, let's just keep moving here. So, I mean, who have you guys seen it being authored from?
I mean, typically it's an owner-driven spec document that the architect authors, right? Like, that's the technical, typical version of it, right? I have a unique experience with Div 1. In fact, when I started my reality capture journey, when I was still working at Turner, the last project we did was a really collaborative design build job. I had just figured out that, the 360 cameras were an applicable technology in the field, and it was valuable. And so get to this job, and typical, state of California Division 1 spec that, as I mentioned earlier, it was 3-ring binders of monthly photos. I was like, we're not doing that. That's dumb. And so I worked with the owner's rep, and through formal, RFI change to that Div 1 spec, I rewrote it to satisfy really what the intent of that spec section is supposed to, what it was originally authored for, which is allow the owner visibility into the monthly progress of the job. Like that, document it in a way that we have contractual evidence that we did what we said and that the job progressed properly. And so we rewrote the spec. I championed rewriting that spec for the customer to get a more valuable output, which was a whole shit ton of 360 photos throughout the
But
life of
before or after the contract was signed?
This was after the contract was signed. Again, nuts and bolts, it was a collaborative design build job. So we had a contract, and our contract outlined us putting together the contract documents, of which the spec book is one, right? So unique scenario, but like anything else, you can change a spec. Any job, if it's a hard bid, low bid, hard bid job, you can write an RFI that says, "Hey, can we change this to one spec if you really want to?"
If you have costs tied to it, though, like we all know how that goes. Like
totally, I'm not saying every GC is motivated to do that, right? If the spec says minimal effort, I'm not going to put in more effort,
Yeah.
But
here's the thing, right? It's what do you constantly hear? Oh, we don't have budget for that, right? Great. I'm not pro give yourself more writing or like put it in writing so you can point at it and say you didn't do what I did, what I wanted you to do, right? It's not a hey, like I gotcha type of scenario. It's what does getting it somewhere in the contract or within your company, whether you're creating a company-wide SOP from the quality department, what does that enable you to do? And I think that's what I kind of want to talk about more here is, budgeting, carrying it, like getting costs carried, whether it's a change order from the ownership, just having more communication around how are we actually going to capture this project for you and what do we actually need, whether it's cost within our own company or the ownership team to provide for us to be able to deliver something that is going to benefit both us and you in a much greater capacity.
Yeah, I mean, I think
everything. Oh, sorry.
No, go for it.
I was going to say, Brian, everything you just outlined implies an intrinsic understanding of the value of the output, right? Like you need to have the GC who cares that, hey, these photos are going to be valuable throughout the life of this project. You need to have an owner who cares that they can reference these projects throughout the maintenance and life cycle of their building, right? There's a mutual benefit of this output, right? And at the beginning of the job in a perfect world, if we were to say, okay, let's review every spec section and figure out how we can make this job more valuable, sure, we'd get to that spec section. We'd all understand, hey, this is a great output. Let's put a couple extra bucks in the budget for it and let's execute on it. Great. But I think in the reality, in the real world, you have often one party that sees the value and dictates it to the other, or one party that sees the value and just holds it for themselves and then tries maybe to sell it back at the end. Like there's a bunch of ways that this could go.
Understood.
I mean, this is like case in point. I mean, why Multivista got to be as successful as they were, right? Like they were targeting owners. They were giving them a Division I spec saying, hey, you should probably include this on your jobs. Oh, and hey, by the way, if you slip our name in there, we won't be mad. And then that comes to be of like the GC, the architect seeing that in the Division I spec and being like, oh, we should probably give these guys a call. Oh yeah. Hey, here's your quote. Here's your, to meet that spec, this is what it's going to need, and multiply that times a bunch of different regions, a bunch of different projects. And again, like fan of Multivista, customer of them for many years. But it is interesting though, Adam, to I think your point of like going after the scenario of you have to show the value for it to be put in there. And that feels almost like the missing point that, again, Multivista knew that and said, okay, we'll go tackle that and go to the source of who can put it in writing into the spec, which they obviously did.
Look, I got a call recently from, undisclosed stadium owner's rep, right? They come to me and say, hey, do you know of this company? Because I know that you guys do something similar. They're going to go capture for us, right? It was like a capture service company. I was like, yeah, great. He was like, yeah, but I already have a lot of staff on this project that we are paying a lot of money, and photo documentation's in their requirements, right? Like that's part of their job to document the site. Great. Let's define what the word document the site means. Does that mean a periodic set of photos on a weekly owners meeting? Or does that mean a complete 360 coverage of every single milestone before it gets covered? Right. And that's what I kind of had to talk about. But yeah, I get what you're saying too, Adam. It's difficult to show everybody the value both on the contractor side and the owner side. But speaking from the contractor side, I believe if you start within your company and if the ownership does not see the value in paying for that extra level of documentation, you should be able to still have some sort of budget or creating an SOP internally to want to at least carry that cost and say, we'll figure out this is worth the investment to us to begin with. And yeah, any tech manager can say, yeah, well, they don't want to pay for it. Boo-hoo, like that's your job. Like you need to prove out these tech tools and show the value of it. Like that's the reality of it. And someone tells you no, it's
I'm on the same wavelength as you are. We covered, I think last week, how much older I am than you are, and I'm not going to bring it back up now. But when I first started in the VDC world in construction, BIM as a service was a line item in a budget. And you fast forward 10 years, the construction industry, at least, in our top 400, we've talked about that list enough times. Like, I don't know that any single one of those in a customer facing budget is listing out BIM services as something that they are going to have the owner pay for as part of their project, because the last 15 years has proven out that, wait a minute, there's so much value in this. We're just doing it. It's part of our SOP. So you take BIM as an example and you apply now this photo documentation to the same exact scenario. I mean, I think we're just in the early phases, man. I mean, the first few years here of really seeing the industry start to adopt this tool and this practice, really. If I have a crystal ball, we did predictions in week 1 here, but in 5-10 years, photo documentation is a standard operating procedure on every project for any of the top ENR 400.
I hope it's not 5 to 10 years. I mean, you're going to have so much more gray hair that we're going to be calling you grandpa. Like that's, I don't know. That to me, I think what's something you said that's interesting, Brian, is like it should be written in there, but there should be mutual value from all parties. Like, let's just be honest. We know and have seen jobs that have been well documented. They typically aren't just being seen by one of the 3 legs of the tripod of architects, owners, and contractors. So I think if all 3 can come to an agreement of saying, yeah, this is extremely valuable. You're telling me that I don't have to fly my design team across the country to go walk the site. Oh, and by the way, you're going to have this as a deliverable at the end of the job. So when you do need to drill into those walls, you'll know what's behind it. Like, oh, and then by the way, as a contractor, you can use this in your weekly stand-up meetings to help coordinate the hundreds of people that are, the trades on your job. Like that to me feels like the golden key of actually getting it excited with people and not just like, there's another add-on. Hey, you're giving me the little tip screen of saying, hey, how much more can you get out of me? Like it just feels like you got to explain the 3-headed value system here that, hey, this isn't just one person's value, which I feel like in some ways, I'm not saying Multivista did this, but like they started at who was going to write the check, and it was the owner. I haven't heard a lot of contractors back in my day when I was working on it that say they got a ton of value out of it because it came at multiple times and you had to coordinate them coming out. Like, but I'm saying now that there is mutual value across all 3 of those parties, that to me feels like the catalyst of what's going to get it into some sort of agreement of saying, yeah, like we should rally behind this thing and make it happen.
I believe if you are a contractor in 2025 and you are starting a 2-year project right now and the ownership does not see the value right now, you are crazy to not believe that they are going to be asking for this towards the end of the project 2 years from now.
That's fair. I mean, that shrinks it from a 10-year to a 2-year, which not as many gray hairs, but
I was referring to the entire industry also, by the way, just FYI.
I mean, there's still people who VE BIM out or BIM services and all, right? So
not everybody's going to come around on this, right? Like we can't look at everything's a bell curve, right? So for 10 years, I'm saying the majority of that bell curve.
Or are projects too small for BIM? Common. Same with the reality capture. Oh, it's too small. It's too small for this. Yeah.
Well, I mean, when your tools price it out of those small jobs, then heck yeah, like of course they are.
Yeah.
I mean,
absolutely.
I don't know. This is just a fascinating topic because I mean, you can tackle it from any different direction. I think the source of what you're asking, Brian, is like, hey, why is it not included or why is it not talked about more at, call it the contractor level? And I'm just saying that it seems like this momentum or initiative, whatever you want to call it, has started at an owner level to get it into specs. At least that's the only one I've seen it done well in. Again, to the Multivista crew of like, hey, that's a good tactic. Like kudos to them. And like excited that they have brought awareness at really all phases at a architect level, contractor level, and obviously especially at the owner level to what the value of this is. It's just now transitioning that into your scenario of like, we got tens of people on this job that could and should be doing this that I'm paying. Like, why are they not the ones out there actually documenting? It's just fascinating. I mean, there is a shift that's moving of like don't know, do you call it like a self-service model of like, hey, like give these teams the tools to do it when they need to do it, and from any angle and perspective they want to do it, and let that value be seen, obviously not only during construction, but to the tens of different stakeholders outside of that job site. Oh, and by the way, 2 to 3 years later after the job's done, when you got to go back and look at something.
Off the record, off the record on a public podcast, let's just say that. There's been scenarios in my career where I have given project teams, like a struggling, just like an assistant superintendent, a project engineer, like a free couple captures without ever having charged them, and sent them a camera kit because their ownership, not their ownership, but the executives at the company were like, hey, we don't really want to give you the money for that. But that team was clearly underwater and they found benefit in it, right? I think a lot of people push and say, yeah, the field doesn't necessarily want to do this, but the people in the suits sometimes also have to make it easier for them. Like, don't make them figure out how they're going to go pay for it. Like, what's $5,000, $10,000 on some of these projects?
Yeah, Brian, I think it's just fascinating. One, wouldn't say Division I specs are like the top thing always talked about, but when you talk about things that have a lot of impact, not only at the start of a job, during a job, after a job, I mean, the whole gamut. I mean, it is something to definitely be talked about. And yeah, I think it does ultimately, I think we talked about this a few minutes ago, it's just, it comes back to education, right? Like you got to start educating folks, not just from a like sitting across a Zoom meeting and, you know, here's this, here's that, like really have the value be felt. And that's what's tough, because I'm like, gosh, I really thought, you know, coming out of COVID, it would be like, oh, dude, how can we not do this? And obviously people were going to go back to jobs. You weren't going to stay in that remote environment all the time. But man, that was a good long period of people seeing what this could really look like. I mean, you start talking about cities inspecting things that way. Like, I don't know, that I came out of COVID thinking like, man, this is what the catalyst is going to be. Folks are going to see what's possible now. And obviously an incredibly unfortunate set of circumstances for that to be seen. But yet there were teams that were getting ultra creative. I mean, keep the gaslight going, keep the job site running. And yeah, that was a way that people did it. And I don't know, it's just interesting that maybe
I was one of them.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of us sat through that experience of, okay, hey, this is where this could be used. But yeah, it is interesting. It's going to take time, but at the end of the day, it's definitely a worthwhile topic that, Brian, I think you bring it up of, hey, what and why hasn't it got talked about, or the airtime that it has?
Absolutely.
All right, let's transition to our last topic here. Mr. Adam, this one's yours, and let's talk about community. You mentioned your superintendent community practice super summit here last Friday, which was awesome. Just a cool opportunity to gather some like-minded individuals around a topic I know a lot of them care about. And I think let's just break into this topic of what is community? What does it mean? What have you guys seen it as? Obviously, it takes on many different shapes and forms, but yeah, Mr. Adam, let's dive into it.
Yeah, we need to clarify one thing right at the very top of the podcast, though, that you said you just flippantly dropped in for everyone. I was sore from the weekend. I need a lot of people to understand what that means and why. First off,
well, minus your age, we know that that's really why you're sore. But
yeah,
you know,
besides, I'm the oldest one on the podcast. Yeah, so this topic of community, yes, superintendents and stuff, and Grant, we can talk about our internal professional community efforts, but I want to take us back out a little bit. Let's get into our feels here after talking about some serious robotics, some Division I contracts, and all this good stuff. But reason I'm sore from the weekend is I compete in kind of a heavy fitness biathlon style competition throughout the year. And so this last weekend was one of those competitions. It's held all over the country. There's people from all walks of life, all different from all over the country. We see familiar faces from event to event, new friends made every single weekend, those sorts of things. Lots of Instagram, social media presence of this particular competition group. And this weekend, again, the reason why I bring this up, there was a particularly interesting and sort of unique thing that happened. And Grant, if you want to cue up the video, we can just kind of quickly play it, and then I'll set some context around it. That'd be
here we go. Let's see if I can transition us over here.
Sorry to put you on the spot there.
No, that's all right. You sent it to me here.
Elite women's podium. You want to take all that stuff?
Oh my God! Congratulations!
Where'd you get that?
I'm 15 weeks. Blair. Okay, I mean, winning is super fun, but even the bigger news.
Yeah, that's awesome.
So obviously what happened there is one of the women's competitors, as she was, the 3 women that started in that video that were accepting their top 3 awards from the weekend. And right at the end there, she whips out the sonogram photos and announces her pregnancy in front of this group of people. I mean, there were probably, 200 people standing there in front of that whole event. And it really, I think, resonated amongst this community of people who, I mean, I've met that woman. I've talked to her a number of times. I wouldn't call her like my closest friend. We're acquaintances through this effort. And so it really got me thinking on my long 14-hour drive home yesterday. What is community? Why is it important? How do we create it? What communities are we part of? And obviously we have Grant and I and Brian in a lot of ways here professionally with Built Different. We're trying to create community. And, we're going through these trials and tribulations of figuring out the answers to these questions. So wanted to put it out for this group to talk about and kind of, just brainstorm a little bit. Brian, I know you have some community background outside of your work stuff. So maybe I'll pitch it to you first and just kind of, with the question of like, what makes a community in your mind?
Yeah. I mean, for me, the communities I've been part of, one probably most relatable to this type of conversation would be there was a mastermind group on people who develop real estate. So about 20 people in Boston, combination of zoning attorneys, architects, people who just actually bought property, real estate agents, etc. And it was interesting because we would kind of just get on a call every Tuesday morning at 7 a.m. and we would talk about, hey, I'm having trouble zoning this deal, or I actually want to liquidate some of these apartments. Like, does anybody in this group want to have the first pass at it? I also thought it was an interesting thing because there's always a common denominator of why we are showing up. But after you kind of get past the who you are, what you do, and how we can kind of work with each other, you kind of fall into this other pattern of what else you into, right? Okay, great. You like photography. Oh, you like playing with drones, or you like to run, right? And it was interesting because each group member had to set like a professional goal and then a personal goal. And you would almost have an accountability team of like 2 to 3 other people of, hey, I want to give up drinking alcohol, or I want to run a marathon this year. And you would kind of get paired on a combination of what your professional goal was, which was, I want to acquire 2 buildings this year, as well as, oh, great, you both all kind of have the same interest. And I think those little side friendships that come out of the community are really what make the community what it is.
Well, Grant, maybe from
your
perspective, there's a couple things there I want to come back to, but yeah, Brian, Grant, anything on your end?
Yeah, I mean, man, what a broad topic, and it's super hard to, in my eyes, to I don't know, bring it down to specific phrases, or it has a lot of different dynamics to it. I think a word, because you guys know I often like to define things and associate things. So like, all right, let's just put words to this. Just connection, and I think connection is an interesting phrase to think about in a community because connections can come from different ways. They can come in person, they can come virtually, they can come over similar hobbies, interests, likes, all those kind of things. And yeah, I mean, Adam, when we were sitting in this, thing a year ago, we were like, well, how are we going to define what we're doing? And a lot of the terms that we came up with was just this idea of connection. We really try to focus on connecting project teams to each other at certain companies. We all know construction is can be very isolating on different projects across from regions and different offices. And so just the idea to connect project teams, and also another initiative is like, how do we connect companies? There's some amazing people that are doing some amazing work out there that oftentimes you don't get to see behind the fence of what it is that they're doing on their project. And just the idea of saying, hey, like, not only do we want to connect you to your own project teams that you may not know about internally, we want to connect you to other companies that are doing some really great things that you can glean from, and your shared pain, shared gain, and opportunities to learn from them. And then last is just I think ultimately community does have to have some form of in-person interaction. Brian, you mentioned kind of that group and showing up, and
we did quarterly meetings in person, but say for example, we were helping each other work on marathons because it was all Boston based. We actually would meet up on our own personal time. It wasn't like every day, but there was a consistency of a meeting.
I think, the third part to this though is just like, you got to have some sort of in-person interaction. Like, yes, communities can stay virtual. And again, we talked about COVID a little earlier. Like, you can stay connected virtually, but at some point you do have to have some sort of in-person gathering, in-person event, in-person, whatever you want to call it, interaction. And I think, that's kind of the third thing that, Adam and I are trying to focus on, at least on this side of it, is, how do we create meaningful in-person experiences? Like, they don't come often. They are very challenging to do because you're taken away from your day-to-day stuff, but they do provide almost 10x the outcomes or outputs from them because of the conversations you have, and obviously the video you showed, Adam. So yeah, I just think community it's obviously impacted all three of our lives in personal ways, professional ways too. And just a quote that I think comes to mind in this term of community is like, a cord of three strands is really hard to break. And you can have one-to-one connections with people, but when you start to really add more people into that fold, they become really strong, and they become strong together. And I think ultimately that's how I define it. Again, it's defined differently by a lot of different people, but that's kind of the tip of the spear of what I feel like you and I, Adam, are trying to kind of do within this endeavor. And it's just kind of been fun to watch and grow and continue to manipulate and make adjustments along the way, and say, hey, maybe we try this, maybe we invest in this. And ultimately community, I think, comes from forms of feedback. Like, we obviously all have to talk and improve the things that we want to try to do. And at the end of the day, it's been fun to represent a group of folks that ultimately, I think, desire this. You can't really go into any of these without a genuine interest to want to be a part of something more connected. And it's fun to be at the maybe at the seat of trying to facilitate some of those.
Have you? I mean, I'm going to ask a question because you two are the head, like the community team. Have you seen or heard of any like really close friendships or anything come out of the group, or like, hey, like, I was able to get advice from so-and-so in this scenario outside of your typical meetings?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple stories that come to mind. I mean, I think, folks in these community crew huddles that we do, that meet on a monthly basis virtually, because we're all kind of spread across the country. We'll talk about at the end of those meetings, like, hey, what events or what conferences are you going to? And I think one cool thing from last year is just a couple of those folks in those crews said, hey, do you want to like present on a topic at a conference together? And I think the situation was, someone backed out and they were looking for someone to backfill, and, called the person up and said, hey, would you mind, hopping on a panel with me? And it came by way of us. We, heard about it, and it was cool to see, it get announced within kind of the conference agenda. And yeah, I mean, that stands out. One thing, this year that we've heard a lot from folks is like just wanting to go tour other job sites. And again, like an in-person experience, like definitely off our radar. Adam and I are fortunate to get to go visit a ton of different jobs, but I think back when I was in those positions, like I drive by all these job site fences and see logos and fence signs up, and I'm like, man, I wonder what they do on the other side of that. And always just kind of hoping and not knowing if that would ever be kind of reality. And yeah, it's been cool. Like that again was self-initiated by the folks of these community huddles that we do, and they're like, hey, would you mind, helping facilitate that and, putting together the RSVPs or the details? And like, yeah, of course. That's an easy thing for us to do. But yeah, those are a few that come to mind. I know Adam has probably a few too on the superintendent side of it.
Yeah. Big one on the superintendent side is, and supers are, I mean, as we know, are generally isolated to kind of their project island. And so there isn't a ton of, normal opportunity, I'll call it, to kind of connect with each other in person outside of kind of our community events. But the big one for me in the last year, our Horizons, Drone Deploy User Conference. We historically have never had superintendents at that. I kind of looked back through the records, and I think I found one event prior that had a superintendent attend with, kind of randomly. And this last year in Scottsdale, we had 7 superintendents show up through this community, outreach, through the community that we're building. And it was phenomenal to hear them, get the feedback from them after that event that said, hey, these types of things are not on our radar. It's not really what we prioritize usually, and it's not what our companies prioritize. It's really not what the industry prioritizes for their particular position. But every single one of them found value in coming, and probably the biggest bit of value was in talking to each other in person about their journey to that point, right? Like, oh, you came out of the concrete, union, you came out of, you were college educated, you came through, the construction management side of things, and now you're a superintendent, like learning each other's paths that got them to that conference at the same time. And then all aligning on, oh, we're all pretty tech forward. We should bounce some ideas off of each other. And I have since heard about kind of second or third hand, whatever, instances where they've referenced each other with questions since then. And so, that to me is kind of the proof in the pudding that you just put people in the same room, and in a lot of ways, without trying to force community, quote unquote, it's like people will connect. I mean, humans in general, we will find commonality and reference that as we go forward. I'm curious, Brian, in your other endeavors there, like how you found those communities, and like how were they built? Like, was it one individual that said, this is what we're going to do? Or was it a team of people that came together on a common interest and, hey, we should just kind of see how this goes and build momentum with, word of mouth? Like what's that been?
Yeah. So it was one individual, but the community in Boston for development is like just real estate is for at least it's just a small city in general, period. Right. So you kind of have an idea of who are some of the A players, and there was so many word of mouth of, hey, there's this group, but so-and-so's in that. Like, great. What was nice about that group is there were the vetting, there was an interview process and there was a vetting done that I knew that by showing up there, I was going to be able to have very high level conversations about these topics that I don't think I could find somewhere else. I actually heard about it because they were featured on a podcast called the Real Estate Addicts Podcast, which is a Boston specific real estate podcast. Mark Savatsky, Dan Rubin, and Ray Hurto have this podcast where they only interview people in the city of Boston that are, same thing, zoning attorneys. They brought on an ADA compliance specialist. Just talk the more niche and more specific, the stronger I believe the community is. I would say in New York City, there's a series of a lot of supper parties where, nice extravagant dinners, 20, 30 people. And sometimes, I've gone and extended invites to those, and I've attended a couple. And the thing that sometimes I find difficulty there is, what is the commonality of conversation? The person across from me is talking about Web3 and AI. The person next to me is an artist, which is great to have a good mix if you're having a party or, a couple things, but it's very difficult to get that group together unless we find something we all kind of like doing, whether it's, if we're all super interested in coffee, great, let's go to some sort of coffee place. I don't know. I'm not massive. I drink Dunkin' Donuts, but the reality of the scenario is with this other place, it's easier to start with the defined commonality where, hey, we're all superintendents. We all share this thing that a lot of other people in our lives don't understand. And then we can connect on the more generic things like running.
Yeah, I think you bring up a very interesting point. And even when Adam and I were first talking about this, it's take over the world, it's bring everyone into this fold. And what's been fascinating is just even the last 18 months has been how almost approaching it backwards, starting small, being okay with it being very niche, being okay with it being very specific in, that is providing value to the end individuals. I think we were maybe trying to focus of oh, well, how can we get stuff out of this? And that quickly flopped on its face. And it's wait a second, maybe we're approaching that wrong. And I think something you brought up, Brian, that, Adam and I have tried to do too is, at the end of the day, yes, in-person things kind of help magnify, I would say the growth and opportunity of a community, but just breaking bread. I mean, sitting across from someone at a meal, getting some sort of experience and having that be a shared memory. We had our deploy day this week, and it's fun. We're doing this at Cowboy Stadium, and it's a cool experience to go and say yeah, I went on a tour of that place, with 70 of our closest folks in the Metroplex here. That, I mean, that I think is the memory that folks remember probably more than, the stuff that we talked about or the PowerPoints and stuff like that too. But like, yeah, it's been a big push of what we're trying to do is like, not just make it formal, but make it fun. And oftentimes I think that can get lost in some of these kind of communal efforts is like, oh, it's very rigid. It's very formal. It's like, man, you got to have fun. And if you're not having fun, I would argue maybe it's not the best, group of folks to, maybe engage with. But yeah, it's just stuff like that. I think that's what makes it really cool. And, a fun part that Adam and I get to do, like our next deploy day is at a go-karting track. And, we, I mean, that's awesome. Like I remember last year when we did it out there, it's cool to put on the GoPros and watch the videos and, see who is actually a stud on the track and, maybe a hustler. And yeah, it's cool. Like those are the things that if you're not having fun, I would maybe question and say, hey, like, is it something that you want to continue to stay invested in? So it's hard though. Like you're obviously doing this in a business sense and you want it to provide value back to the end individual, but don't limit the fun factor. Like, and it's been really cool. We obviously are super fortunate to go and plan fun things too. And Horizons being one of those, like Adam got to take all of his superintendents out to a Cardinals game last year, like how cool is that? And that's the thing that they're talking about, even a year later is like, well, how can we go and do something like that again as a group, whether it is a nice meal or, a fun experience too.
I think if, speaking of the go-karting, I think if Adam was like a Mario Kart character, he would be Bowser.
I was thinking Bowser too. Yeah, that's awesome.
I'll take that or Donkey Kong, one of the two.
Yeah. Who's your go-to character, Brian?
Toad.
Princess.
I knew it. I knew you were going to take Toad. You savage.
Just I
go Yoshi. I'm a big Yoshi fan.
I can see that.
It's no Ted Lasso, but he gets the job done. So
yeah, we need the update on the Ted Lasso thing. I don't think we brushed over it last time. Have you watched an episode yet?
No, I have not watched. I probably watched Connor's clip of him dubbing my face over that about 30 times. It was a little creepy. I showed my wife, and she's like, "Maybe you are Ted Lasso." That's pretty impressive. But no, no, I haven't. Actually, I was going to bring up a show today that I was going to see if you guys had seen, and I was going to. Oh yeah. Bro, oh dang it, Brian! I'm bummed I missed this in the contract. All my contract experience comes from watching the show Suits. Adam got me hooked on that, and
Great
show. Suits and like my construction law class that I definitely got the worst grade of my college career in, but I loved it. It was amazing. So I'm definitely not your contract expert, but I can watch Suits, and boy, do I feel like a pretty knowledgeable person when it comes to the business of law because of it. So.
And if you're not a contract expert, check out our sponsor, Document Crunch.
Yeah, nice. There it is. Maybe we can see if we can get them on or help sponsor us. But yeah, it's been a good time, fellas. Good discussions.
They're not actually our sponsor, FYI. I have some friends over there.
Hey, there we go. We can see if they can pop back in here. But fellas, it's been fun. Good conversations this week. TBD if we'll all wear black next week. We'll see how that all plays out. But yeah, been fun. And like I said, thanks for listening in, tuning in. Hopefully these conversations have been fun, enjoyable as a part of your journey along the way. And look forward to catching you guys next time. Take care, fellas.
See you, boys.